Well, hello and welcome to today's HIPAA Chat. I'm Carol Flagg of Answers Media Network. Thanks for joining in today. If you're new to HIPAA Chat, welcome aboard. This hour of time that we'll be spending together is very conversational in the chat in HIPAA Chat and very Q&A driven. If you're a repeat HIPAA Chat attendee, thank you so much for taking your time again today. We love having you. HIPAA Chat, of course, is sponsored by eFax Corporate, which is a brand of J2 Cloud Services. As of December 31st, 2017, J2 had achieved 22 consecutive fiscal years of revenue growth. They also have products for secure transmission of ePHI, so please make sure you visit them at enterprise.efax.com. There you go. And of course, this HIPAA Chat is also produced by Answers Media Network. We obviously have a series of websites dedicated to healthcare delivery and health IT, as well as, of course, our growing in popularity internet radio station, Healthcare Now Radio. You can live stream our station at healthcarenowradio.airtime.pro, and we'd appreciate you taking a turn here and listening in. Of course, back with us again is our host, David Harlow. He's a healthcare lawyer, consultant, and award-winning blogger with 30 years of public and private sector experience. His focus, of course, is digital health law and policy, HIPAA, all things related to HIPAA, of course, and security. And he works with covered entities, business associates, healthcare providers, analytics companies, and more. He is also host of the radio show Harlow on Healthcare that airs on our internet radio station, Healthcare Now Radio. You can tune in weekdays at 4:30 Eastern to stream the station on any device. Contact him at david@harlowgroup.net. Make sure you read his award-winning blog, which is healthblog.blawg.com. You can find archives of his past episodes of his radio show on our SoundCloud station or the program page on Healthcare Now Radio. And follow him on Twitter at healthblog, BLAWG, and at Harlow on HC, which is his Twitter handle for his radio show. Joining us today is a friend of both of ours, been friends for many years, is John Lynn. He's the founder of Healthcare Scene, which is a network of health IT and media sites, including EMR and HIPAA. Collectively, Healthcare Scene sites viewed over, sorry, not average, but has been viewed over 18 million times. He has over 80,000 social media followers and 50,000 subscribers. He also launched the very popular healthcare IT marketing and PR conference called HIPMIC in 2014. He attends a lot of different events. He speaks at a lot of different events, including HIMSS, CES, South by Southwest, and more. Contact him at john@healthcarescene.com. Read his blog, EMR and HIPAA, and of course, follow him on Twitter at TechGuy. All righty, so one more piece of business, and then we're gonna get to the heart of our conversation, which is if you want to check out past HIPAA Chat events, you can do so on YouTube. You could also listen to them as podcasts on demand on our SoundCloud station channel, HCN Radio. And then, of course, you can follow us on HIPAA Chat, where we take questions related to HIPAA and share information. And now on to today's topic, blockchain and HIPAA, obviously a hugely trending topic these days. And David, it's going to be kind of fun, I think, to devote the rest of this hour, quite a bit of time here, talking about blockchain and HIPAA with John.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carol. Thanks for teeing this up. It's a significant issue. It's something that we've all been hearing about over the last few years. And the question is, of course, what are we going to do about it? Are we just going to keep hearing about it, keep talking about blockchain, or are we at the point of implementing some tools related to blockchain to help us in the healthcare, IT security, and privacy space?
Yeah, and I think that we're going to be dissecting this into 4 different areas, and then, of course, opening it up for questions from our attendees. And so let's just start right in and welcome John to today's HIPAA Chat.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm excited to share some insights. This is a hard topic, so I think we're gonna have a lot of fun. But hopefully, we can give some people listening some good insights, some practical views on what's really happening with blockchain and how that relates to HIPAA as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Well, then I say the two of you just start down this path of blockchain, or the links of blockchain, I guess, right?
Right. We'll step from block to block down the chain on our way to satisfying HIPAA.
If
So,
everyone would do that, they'd be HIPAA compliant, I think. Maybe that's a good analogy.
Right.
yeah. So, the sort of a couple of definitional things, sort of, from a HIPAA perspective, why is blockchain interesting? Blockchain generically is an instrument that can be used for trusted exchange of information. And if something is entered in the blockchain, then it is immutable, not changeable, and it is essentially attested to by one or more parties. Rather than getting into a technical definition of blockchain characteristics, I think we'll just talk about those things as they relate to our broader topic. From a HIPAA perspective, we're always interested in health data being held private and secure. And HIPAA requires that there be established administrative, technical, and physical bounds by which data is kept private and secure. The question here is, does blockchain satisfy those administrative, technical, and or physical security requirements? And whether it satisfies other sorts of requirements of HIPAA. So, for example, let's say it does satisfy a technical security requirement under HIPAA. There are also other sections of HIPAA that may require that someone who holds a record change a record at some point in the future, either because something turns out to be entered in an error, or for various reasons, a patient may seek to have something changed or removed from a record under HIPAA. If it is an immutable record kept on blockchain, then can that satisfy HIPAA? I think that's an open question. Obviously, if something is deleted, in many cases, you want to have a record of the deletion and so forth. So blockchain could be helpful there. But you're then still keeping the original data, which was sought to be deleted. And to me, that strikes me as problematic. So are there some possibilities here, some options for using blockchain in some part of the health IT structure that goes towards satisfying HIPAA along with other demands, both demands in the marketplace and demands of regulation? But I think it's not something that is going to solve all problems for everyone immediately. And John, I'd like to hear your perspective on this question.
Sure. I think you bring up a very interesting point about being able to update or delete something from the blockchain because, as you said, that's impossible to do. However, I think it still can be HIPAA compliant if you record what's been deleted and what the latest updated record is. So I actually think that's not an issue if it's a well implemented system that basically notates which things have been updated, which things are essentially inactive and no longer there. And I think that's a high quality thing because if you think about it, from many of the EHR systems or other health IT systems out there, many of them evolved over time where initially if you deleted something it was just gone and there was almost no audit trail, which was its own type of HIPAA violation because they didn't keep track of what was changed or other things. So I think most of them have finally learned that. And one nice thing with the blockchain is that will never happen. No one could go in there and delete something without a full record of who was doing it and what was changed and all of those things. So I think in that regard, it's actually a good thing. I think the bigger question for me And certainly the question, does putting PHI on the blockchain satisfy HIPAA? The answer is simple. Of course not, right? I mean, there's so much more to HIPAA than just what blockchain can provide. It's not like you can say, okay, we're blockchain, so now we're HIPAA compliant. Like, that's just the obvious answer. I mean, you have to have a security compliance officer, right? A HIPAA compliance officer. So if you don't have that, blockchain can't satisfy it, and then you're not HIPAA compliant. So there's certainly other things, but maybe the bigger question, the real question, which I'm interested in your thoughts on, is whether blockchain is HIPAA compliant from the sense of, okay, if it's a private blockchain on private servers, then okay, you can implement some HIPAA compliance. But if you do it on the public blockchain, if you do it, say, on the Ethereum network and you create a DApp or something along those lines, and that information is essentially distributed across a network of nodes, miners is what they're called in the blockchain world. If it's distributed across all of them, is that HIPAA compliant? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Certainly, it's encrypted in a way, and it's parsed into different pieces and elements like that. But can a public blockchain be HIPAA compliant?
Yeah, it strikes me, John, as a very important distinction between the public and the private blockchain implementations. And I think there's certain use cases, even within healthcare, where public blockchain would be appropriate, but probably not for PHI. I think PHI ought to be on a private blockchain. And then the question is who gets credentials, right? Because ultimately the whole goal of this in terms of interoperability and access of data is for information to be freely available to any healthcare provider who needs it and for any patient who needs or wants it about themselves. But the classic situation of someone who shows up in an emergency room unconscious and you need to get their records to find out contraindications to proposed treatment, you need some sort of break the glass mechanism to get to their health records. If it's on a healthcare only verified participant private blockchain, then that's fine. But then you've just sort of deferred away from the blockchain itself the question of security, the question of privacy. How are those individuals verified? So if I live in Eastern Massachusetts and I'm admitted unconscious to a hospital in Western Massachusetts, how do we know that the people who have been quote unquote verified as healthcare providers at that Western Massachusetts hospital are who they say they are? That's an issue that's sort of outside of the blockchain. So the blockchain alone, as you said, is not a panacea to all of the world's problems.
Yeah, and it really kind of goes to the next question on our list and discussion. Really, is blockchain secure? So, it's one of my least favorite questions and one of my pet peeves, because it's like, okay, well, blockchain is secure at one level, but if you have the rights to be able to do it, and you're able to go in there and see if it's blockchain secure or not, but, because you've been given permission and you can go in and see the data on the blockchain. Well, no amount of encryption or distributed nature of data is going to help you. If you have the keys to the car, then you can
Right,
drive
game
away with.
over. Yeah.
So, to me, that's I think one of those challenges. Like you said, if there is that break the glass opportunity, then blockchain's not going to secure it from people who want to abuse the break the glass option that allows someone to do it. Now, of course, there are legal remedies for that. If someone inappropriately uses the break the glass, then there's other penalties, but you can't really stop that. If those keys have been given.
Right. I think that's an important observation. If I can generalize the observation, it's that this is a powerful technical tool, but we can't expect it to do everything, right? And there's still other boundaries, there are other protections that need to exist around the technical tools, the physical tools, as I mentioned, that's required under HIPAA, the administrative tools, and as you say, the regulatory and legal tools that surround those as well. All of these things need to be working together in order to provide the appropriate level of data fluidity and data security at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting your response to my question, which is if it includes PHI, you basically said I'd be concerned about a public blockchain, right?
Right.
Because if they're covered by HIPAA and it includes PHI, then that would be a worrisome thing for you. Obviously you clarified there's some other use cases, which I think would be if I as a patient choose to put it on the blockchain, that's my own right, and that's not really covered under HIPAA because I'm not a covered entity. But if you are a covered entity and you put it on a public blockchain, you were worried about that, and I think that's a fair assessment because when you look at blockchain, it's essentially a distributed ledger of all the transactions, of all the contracts, of all the data that's being put on the blockchain. And when you say that to a HIPAA regulator, I can already just see them squirming. Just when you say that word distributed, I'm sure that scares them. And their initial gut reaction is if it's distributed, it must be unsafe and we should fight against that. Now, whether that's true or not is a technical question, but my gut tells me that the regulators don't have that type of sophisticated ability and technical understanding, and quite frankly, the resources to tap into that to understand what that should be. And so I have a feeling, and obviously, we need some more regulation on this and more examples, but my gut feeling is their reaction is going to be distributed is scary, and so we're going to regulate against it, at least initially, till we can understand it better.
Mhm. Are you suggesting, John, that they don't have to be quite as scared as all that?
That's a good
Well,
question.
as a regulator, I'd always be scared, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, some of it is a needle in a haystack security, right? And other things along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
A needle in a haystack plus the encryption algorithms plus a number of other things, right? That keep it secure.
Even on a public blockchain.
Yeah, I believe so, right? I mean, I think if we did the full technical analysis, I think that you would look at that and say, hackers are not going to hack that. They may hack something that's on the blockchain, but they're going to use a phishing scheme to convince someone to give you a password, which then accesses the blockchain. They're not actually going to go to a mining computer, hack it, access what's on there, and then figure out which elements of the blockchain are PHI that relate to Britney Spears, so that then you have a HIPAA violation, right? I mean, like it's just that's so far fetched. Whereas if you think about the people who literally have access to it, that's where the HIPAA breach risks exist in my mind. It's not, hackers take the path of least resistance. And when you look at blockchain, they're not going to go try to hack the blockchain because there's a lot of easier ways to do it. And that's really where humans are involved. So they'd
Sure.
rather
So
have
it's going to be
humans
the
than
social engineering and the human exploiting human factors to get a password or a login or whatever, and then access something, whether it's on a public or a private blockchain.
Exactly. So my feeling is if the regulators restrict blockchain because it's distributed, I think that would be a fallacy. And we essentially have the same breach problems that we have in every other IT system, which is a challenge, and they should address. But the blockchain itself, to me, is not the security hole.
So would you say that blockchain is more secure than, say, an encrypted cloud instance? I don't know if
So
that's,
here's,
apples and oranges, but,
no, I
the
mean, I
question we're
think it's
thinking about
similar.
is whether it's secure.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's similar. But here's the problem I have with many of the blockchain companies out there, and especially in healthcare, but it actually happens across all industries, is that the blockchain companies really mislead the consumer. because they say, oh, it's on the blockchain, and so therefore we're secure. And by saying that, they give the impression that it secures more than it really does. In some ways, it does secure your health information in a better way than a cloud instance. But I see it as just one layer of security that's better and more powerful than, say, a cloud hosted application. So it's more secure because it's distributed, and there's no one point where if a hacker hacks it, they now have access to every EHR record for every Athena Health user because it's all on one cloud hosted system, right? Or,
Right.
yeah, I mean, I guess it's across multiple servers, but you get the idea, right? I mean, it creates this honeypot for hackers, whereas in blockchain, it distributes that information across hundreds and thousands of machines, which makes it more secure just by its distributed nature. But what it doesn't to do, and this is why it is my pet peeve with blockchain companies,
Hmm.
is they give the perception that it does that, but then it also secures people from hacking your password, people from hacking, the social engineering side again, right? And so they say, oh, you must be secure because it's on the blockchain, and so they give this impression that it's securing more than it really does. So yeah, I mean, I would say, to answer your question specifically, it does provide more security because of the distributed nature, but it doesn't solve 75% of the other security problems that every application has, whether it's on the blockchain or in the cloud.
Right, which are sort of the administrative and the sort of the wraparound, the first line of defense kind of questions. Um, and I think that's a fair comment.
Definitely.
So there's some use cases that might already be rolling out in the wild, so to speak, and there are others that I think are really much further down the road, if ever. I'm not aware of a blockchain-based EHR in production at the moment, but
Nope.
there's certainly other kinds of tools that can be used that are leveraging blockchain technology. Things like provider directories that might be a little more up to date than what we're currently used to seeing.
Yep.
Um, there could be other sorts of administrative type systems that can be enabled better through use of blockchain. Are there other examples that come to mind for you, John?
Sure. Yeah, and I think we could put in the show notes, or I'll tweet it out on @TechGuy as well after. But David Holding from Microsoft, he gave me the best framework that I've seen or heard about in a post he did on EMR and HIPAA, where he talked about, okay, what really is going to take off in healthcare? Where does blockchain make sense? Because there's a lot of companies that just want to get funding, so they say they're a blockchain company, but they're actually not even using the features of blockchain that make sense, like smart contracts, like the distributed nature. They're almost using it as a marketing tool and a fundraising tool to raise money for their startup, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to really using the features. But David shared the framework that it makes sense to him, and it made a lot of sense to me when I read it, is that it makes sense to use blockchain initially in existing B2B networks where healthcare organizations are already transacting around some sort of use case. So, the reality of blockchain is it's much more powerful when there's a network of people that want to connect and share something, and they need some sort of trust between their organizations to make a use case work. You gave the great example of provider credentialing. You did provider directory. Provider directory is a great example where understanding who the provider is, understanding what their coverages are, and having trust that they really are part of that network, or other information around that provider, and maybe even that they really are a provider that should be seeing patients. That's a powerful thing, and that use case already exists. I mean, they've been creating these directories already. The other example that I mentioned accidentally was provider credentialing.
Right,
That's
right.
another great example, right? Where you have these relationships in these use cases where multiple hospitals need to know if a doctor is credentialed appropriately or not. I think that's another great example where blockchain can help do that and create the trust and create these smart contracts between various healthcare organizations that they can be able to get that information in a trusted way because it's an immutable record, as we talked about. Some other examples really are around the supply chain side. I think you can do it both on the drug side, and also on the medical device side. So how do you track either a drug or a medical device, and how do you trace it through the supply chain? And how, when it gets to a hospital, can they trust that, in fact, that was the drug that was distributed by the pharmaceutical company in a trusted way, and that they can verify that, yeah, this is indeed what was sent. So I
Yeah,
think
I was
that's
going to
another
say
interesting
that's one of my favorite use cases, sort of the supply chain for pharma and devices, because that's super critical. And it's also from the perspective of, you mentioned smart contracts in passing a couple of times. I want to circle back to those. From a smart contract perspective, this is sort of a pretty, binary kind of thing for the most part. It's like, yes, no, this is a legitimate product or it's a counterfeit product. That's pretty straightforward. On the device side, it's a little more nuanced, but that's an important use case in order to be able to track and direct, for example, software updates or notifications of software or firmware updates, things like that.
Exactly, and you can see when with recalls, this type of tracking is going to be really powerful.
Right, right.
So another example that's a little bit more out there, and I think it's still quite early, is anti-fraud as well. I think, there's some potential there with the immutable record and with the distributed nature of it to really be able to identify fraudulent activity. I think there's still quite a bit of work there to really make it happen. But as more things are on the blockchain and that information shared, I think we'll have better anti-fraud capabilities as well.
hmm
Okay.
I just want to throw in my 2 cents about smart contracts, which is in some of the use cases that we were talking about, it is pretty straightforward. Some of the questions are pretty binary, and of course, for a machine administered contract, that's what it has to be. Everything has to break down into zeros and ones. But the practical reality is that there are certainly contracts written. I've seen my share of contracts written that are not quite so binary. And even if they're translated into the quote unquote smart contract approach, there could still be disputes about whether some condition is met or not. But if you apply the smart contract to something that is on the blockchain, then some transaction has already happened and it is immutable, right? And there could still be a dispute about the meaning of the smart contract. So that to me is somewhat concerning.
No, and it will definitely evolve as they become more mature.
All right.
Right.
Okay. Well, all of this is obviously great fodder and setup for the for taking questions from the audience. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start right in here in no particular order. I want to remind our audience that you can reach out to David and John via email, David at harlowgroup.net and John at healthcarescene.com. And make sure you check out their respective blogs and, of course, on Twitter. First and foremost, you talk about both the public and the private blockchain being used, but will it only be the private side as a viable option for healthcare?
Well, I
Well,
think John articulated pretty
Yeah.
clearly a view that no, public blockchain will work for this use case as well. Now, is there anything you'd like to add, John, to what you just said before?
Yeah, I mean, I would just push even more that there's plenty of personal health use cases that are going to be on the blockchain that are going to happen, and that can happen just fine on the public blockchain. In fact, one of the beauties of, say, being on the Ethereum blockchain is that those tokens have literal value. So if you create a system that rewards patients for doing certain actions, whether it's grabbing their records, sharing their health information, whatever it might be, if you reward them with tokens that are on the Ethereum blockchain, which is a public blockchain, then you're literally giving them cash value that they could cash out if they wanted to. And so I think that, when you look at the reward side of things and motivating patients to do healthy behaviors, that's where the public is even more interesting than a private one, because it's essentially an exchange of value, which is what you should be, we really should be giving patients for doing appropriate health actions. So I think that's where the most exciting stuff is going to happen. And, luckily it's not covered by HIPAA in most cases, but hopefully even HIPAA will expand to allow insurance companies and other providers to provide these same type of rewards on the public blockchain as well.
Right. And the transaction costs on the one hand are much less if you're sharing Ethereum tokens as the reward. On the other hand, if anybody wants to cash them out into dollars or another currency, the cost of doing that may be prohibitive. I think somebody had put something on the blockchain where you could, order pizza, but the transaction costs of putting value onto the chain and getting it off of the chain are end up being much more than the value of the pizza.
Sure, and there's a volatility issue too, right?
Right.
Friends
So,
gave 2 Ethereum tokens to people, and then they went from $10 to $1,000, and now they lost a lot of value because so that's another issue with sharing that.
mm, is a couple questions here then. Is blockchain technology viable for healthcare in terms of cost?
I think so, right? I think it has to be the specific use cases. I think there's an overarching principle I heard recently from Ben Horowitz, one of the Andreessen Horowitz venture capital company founders. He was talking about blockchain. He said, here's the problem with blockchain, is that blockchain is a new computing platform. And he said every decade or so we get a new computing platform that comes and it changes a lot of things. But the problem with these new computing platforms is that they're worst in almost every way, except it has
Mm.
some new capability that makes it unique and provides new opportunities. And that's actually a perfect description of blockchain. It's worse in every way right now than, say, even a relational database. If you want to store data, it's way worse than any of these MongoDBs or other NoSQL databases when it comes to data analysis. But it's so much better than all of those other things in one distinct way, which is Ben Horowitz said the difference is it creates a trust, and it allows you to program trust into the data in a distributed platform. And he said that's what makes it so unique. And he used the example. He said, if you go back to a smartphone, when we first got smartphones, it was the same situation. Everyone looked at the smartphone and said, why would I want to ever use it? It's so slow, the screen's small, it's hard to enter data, I can't type as fast, all of those things, he said. But then over time, all of those things improved. But the smartphone also had things that enabled a new set of applications. It had a GPS, it had a phone in it. I mean, it had a camera in it. It had connectivity. It had those things that made it really unique and opened up new applications like Uber and Lyft and other applications. Instagram came because we had the camera. So I think we're going to see the same thing with blockchain. I thought that was a really nice view in healthcare. And this is a long answer to your question, but blockchain is offering something new, which is trust, programmable trust that's distributed. And so can we use that in a number of instances in healthcare to be able to do something more effectively, like sharing health data from an HIE across multiple organizations? I think so. And will that be at a lower cost? Yes. Would we want to convert an EHR to blockchain right now where it's slower, harder to access? No, of course not, because it doesn't leverage what makes blockchain unique, which is that distributed, trusted nature.
So I wonder if Horowitz has read Winston Churchill, who once said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms of government.
Out there.
That's fair. I mean, and, this was his vision. We'll see how it plays out. But
Yeah.
my feeling is that blockchain is not a panacea for people yet, and it's not going to replace a lot of the applications we use today. But it will enable new applications that we hadn't even thought about.
Yeah. You mentioned HIE and I guess interoperability. One of the attendees wants to know, do you think the Blue Button 2.0 might at some point begin using blockchain?
I don't know your thoughts, David. So, I mean, I think Blue Button 2.0 is kind of a protocol that people can use to download and share data. So, all of the HR vendors have pretty much implemented it. A lot of payers have implemented it. Will they convert that to blockchain? I don't think so. But will there be, in fact, there already are multiple vendors that are on the back of this that take your Blue Button data and put it on the blockchain as what I call an HIE of one, a personal HIE. So I'm the HIE of my own health records from my various providers. Absolutely, they're already doing that. So I can see that happening. But do I see EHR vendors or others like that putting Blue Button on it? Probably not, because it's really a protocol to access the data that they're already storing.
Right, I would agree. And I guess the question is sort of the HIE of one question. Are there going to be enough usable client applications to access that information? Do we make the individual the HIE? Is the individual become the default HIE during some interim period? Or are we leapfrogging that expected future through other developments that have been happening, like the Commonwealth Care Quality collaboration, where data can be transferred more easily from one provider organization to another? Or do we still need this HIE of one interim step? And in that circumstance, could blockchain be an important part of that? Yes, but I would agree, at least in the immediate future, that's not going to directly link to Blue Button interface.
Okay. This relates to talking about the monetization that you were addressing as far as using cryptocurrency for patients. Could you please comment on other use cases, monetization of personal health records and DNA data? Could this impact clinical trials?
I mean, for clinical trials, the issue is always developing a clean database to use. Well, one of the issues, but on the data front, the issue is having a clean database to use, and the verification of individual blocks of data using this approach would help enormously in terms of ensuring that the data that's being looked at as part of a study is quote unquote clean data.
Yeah, I think it's interesting from Yeah, I mean, the one is how do they store the data from the trial? The other is how do they recruit the patients? So if patients have already uploaded their data into, onto the blockchain and it's available, it could be easily searched based on certain parameters to help them discover clinical trial. I think the other thing that David didn't talk about that I think is powerful from a clinical trial standpoint is rewarding patients through the blockchain for sharing their data. So, there's an interesting vision out there that says, hey, if we store all of this health information on the blockchain, and I go in and access all of this health data for a research study, for a clinical trial, for whatever I'm doing to try to improve my company, improve health of people. If I use that data, I should reward the patient for using their data, which doesn't happen today in almost any case. But with blockchain, you could do essentially micro rewards, a small token for using their data, and reward patients for doing it. It's an interesting concept. We'll see, if it can get wide enough and large enough, and if the benefits are enough for patients to really care and want that token.
Mm.
I think it solves a problem that's out there because, as I was saying earlier, the issue is often an issue of transaction costs. And to the extent that researchers or others are perhaps already willing to compensate patients for use of their data, the transaction costs involved with making a micropayment often dwarf the micropayment itself. So it's just sort of dismissed out of hand. And we need to go no further than New York Times headlines of a week or so ago involving cancer hospital in New York City to look at the question of what happens even when something is done as the institution says according to all of their protocols. The feeling is that somehow some research is being done that's going to be commercialized on the backs, so to speak, of patient data, and patients should have some opportunity to have some piece of the action, or at least to decide whether or not they want it.
Yeah, my fear is a little different on that. My fear is that, okay, let's start paying patients for the data because, there's huge, billion-dollar companies trading on the backs of, publicly traded companies that have made billions of dollars on the backs of health data and patients' data. So they say, okay, let's start paying the patients. But my fear is that in aggregate, it's worth billions. But if we spread it across all the patients, are you going to be excited to get $7.50 for your data, right? Like if that's
Right,
the
right.
distributed nature of individual data is not worth much, but in aggregate it's worth billions. So, I don't think as a patient you're going to be excited to get, a nice deposit of 350 because that's how much your data was worth. It's not that exciting, even though the intent's right that they should be rewarded for their data being used.
Right. Well, I think I've often taken that position and argued that mailing out the Starbucks card, the proverbial Starbucks card, is sort of not worth the trouble. And others say to me, well, you're thinking about this wrong, or actually there is greater data and, excuse me, greater value in certain kinds of data, particularly as you're suggesting, John, some individuals might be pre-screened to participate in a study because of some particular characteristics of their medical records. The value may in fact be greater.
Yeah, and then
And
it
in
creates
that
all
case,
sorts of
then,
perverse incentives,
mhm,
right?
right.
If you're worth more, your data is worth more than someone else, am I discriminating against you? I don't, creates a lot of interesting ethical challenges, I think.
Ethical questions. So if I understand correctly, it looks like the cryptographic algorithm is not to make the data secure, but to provide the log of records on data modification, thus to hit the idea of data monitoring for HIPAA compliancy.
So I would say that the nice thing with blockchain is it built encryption and all of that into it just natively as part of it. So, it's really just a feature rather than the core tenant. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's really about storing the data in a distributed nature so that, let's use the example. we saw this. There's a company called PatientDirected.io run by Tom Giannulli. He built an EHR, everything, right? So he's been living in this world for a long time.
Long
He
time.
built
Yeah.
a application called Patient Directed that literally goes in and uses direct messaging. So it's using a protocol that every EHR vendor has. It sucks down the data, puts it on the blockchain, and then he actually sent it from that patient directed to another EHR using direct and was able to do that, right? So now that data, that record was pulled from the EHR into the blockchain, and it was stored on the blockchain and could be shared around, right? I mean, it's a powerful, when you see it and you look at it, you're like, well, that could have been any application. Who cares that it's on the blockchain, right? From the user interface perspective, the user almost doesn't even know it's on the blockchain. In fact, it almost doesn't care. It's kind of like the Intel Inside sticker on every one of our laptops, right? Or at least a lot of our laptops. It's saying, oh, I care about what's inside, but I'm not actually but it doesn't really impact my user experience at all. And anyway, I mean, I think that example shows what really happens. The data is getting stored on there and it's distributed across a whole network of things. But let's say patient directed disappears. And now you're like, hey, I want to access that data. Well, since it's all stored on the blockchain, if you have those blockchain keys, you could just build your own patient directed and replace him. So that's the other promise of building on the blockchain, is that if a company decides to disappear, or if they start off going a different direction, and a competitor could come up and say, hey, well, you own the data, you own access to the blockchain. I can build the same application on top of that data and go a different direction. So it's many ways like an open source platform and some of those ideals that let you not have to be tied in to a specific company, because the data is all stored on the blockchain.
John, going back to something you were talking about earlier, that would assume that it's on a public blockchain and that it is something that is maintained by someone or someones with sufficient staying power. So, for example, if it's on an Ethereum blockchain, that assumes that Ethereum sticks around, or is that not necessarily so?
No, I believe so, right? But I mean, the nice thing is if Ethereum doesn't stick around, you could actually start your own Ethereum and do it, right? So, yeah, but I agree. If it's a private blockchain, that would be, I think, a different scenario where you wouldn't have that same benefit.
Someone wants to know, do you think blockchain could eventually be mandated then? I mean, when they say mandated, I don't know if the attendee is referring to mandated as part of HIPAA or just mandated as part of,
Well, mandated, I assume, as
but
part of some
part of,
sort of data storage,
right,
security, infrastructure,
securing
going to be
PHI,
compliant
right?
with future federal rules. My thought is that no, that wouldn't happen. That thus far, HIPAA, a lot of people like to complain about HIPAA and that it's out of date, et cetera, et cetera. For all its potentially being out of date, it's a remarkably flexible rule, and it can accommodate new technologies as they come. And it deliberately defers security questions to NIST. So there are guidelines that are issued by NIST periodically, and actually the data security guideline that is incorporated by reference into HIPAA is currently being revisited by NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology. So the rule doesn't need to change. Standards may change over time because as time marches on, things do change. That standard relates to characteristics of technologies rather than mandating specific technologies. So short answer, I wouldn't expect a mandate to use blockchain. Longer answer, I would expect that the understanding of what it means to be secure will evolve over time in ways that we can't really project right now because it's in the future. So blockchain may be part of that, and there may be other technologies that we don't even know how to name yet that may be part of that as well.
That's a great description. They don't mandate specific technology, so it's unlikely. But the idea that their security best practices and stuff would essentially, the guidelines would essentially be best satisfied by blockchain in some instances seems like a reasonable progression that could happen.
Mhm. Is this, I love this question, is, because David and I were kind of talking about this before we started, is blockchain getting the same level of attention outside the US?
Even more so, I think. Many argue that they're afraid that the U.S. will fall behind and not be the epicenter of blockchain. There's massive efforts by many countries to be the blockchain capital. Even, I guess, if you count Puerto Rico part of the U.S., even there, but they're a territory, so they can make some of their own rules. And many of the blockchain people I know are creating havens there in Puerto Rico where it's semi like living in the US, but they avoid a lot of taxes and other things. So, yeah, I actually think that there's a huge fear for many that the US is actually going to fall behind because of our regulatory environment. And I think healthcare is a perfect example where if the regulations come out around HIPAA that don't allow for things around blockchain, they're going to happen in other countries, and the U.S. will just be too afraid to use them.
And they're already happening, as Carol alluded to. Estonia, I believe, has said that their national health system records are now on the blockchain. It's just, it doesn't have the population of the U.S. So does that mean that the problem is easier to solve if the N is lower? Perhaps, but there's the same basic blocking and tackling that has to go on. So I think, the short answer is it possible to have that done? Yes. Is it happening elsewhere in the world? Yes. Does the U.S. sometimes move more slowly than other countries? Then do U.S. institutions sometimes move more slowly than other institutions? Sure. Some of that has to do with size. Some of that has to do with sort of uh, um, uh, industry-based conservatism, but the change may happen.
So my friend runs a blockchain security company, and he's always posting on Facebook or Twitter these random things at random hours. And I think at one point he posted, "When does my day ever end?" And then I think he put like hashtag never because it's an international company, right? Because so
Right.
much blockchain is happening all over that, he's like, when do I do a conference call with a client? Well, whenever they're up, and that's all day. So it definitely is going to be an international effort.
Yeah. I mean, Dave, you talk, and you have many times talked about sort of, the flexibility of HIPAA. One of the attendees want to know, though, is HIPAA, though, an obstacle, a serious obstacle for blockchain implementation in the healthcare industry? Could it hold it back?
I wouldn't say it's an obstacle. I think the only way in which it could be an obstacle is if promoters of blockchain-based technologies sort of get too far out in front of the maturity of the platform and the use cases. If the platform and the use cases and the implementations can be built to comply with HIPAA, and that doesn't mean that they have to be twist and turn in an uncomfortable way. It just means they have to demonstrate that they can satisfy either alone or together with other elements. And I think John and I would both say has to include other elements to satisfy HIPAA requirements of administrative, physical, and technical security. Uh, if all those boxes are checked, then that's okay. Uh, the the rule again is fairly technology agnostic.
Yeah, and I would say the bigger fear is not that HIPAA will stop it, because, and you've probably talked about this before, the problem with HIPAA is usually not the law. It's usually the people who want to use it as an excuse not to do something, not to
Exactly.
change, not to adopt a new platform, whatever. So, but is that going to be real? Oh, for sure. I mean, you can already imagine the people that when they see blockchain, they're like, oh, no, HIPAA. And you're like, well, HIPAA's not really an issue. And they'll be like, oh, I don't care, HIPAA. You're like, just because they don't want to change, they don't want to adopt a new system, whatever. I mean, there's a wide variety of reasons why people use HIPAA as the scapegoat, even though it doesn't really apply.
You talk about smart contracts. David, could you just quickly define what a smart contract is, and could it be used to make the payer-provider interactions more efficient?
It is really a series of, it really has to be broken down into a series of sort of yes/no questions in order to define a condition under which something happens, something gets written to the blockchain, right? It could be a payment, it could be a transaction, it could be a release of data, but it's a higher level of sort of if this then that, right? That's really what the agreement is. There's an agreement that under certain conditions, something is going to happen. And again, my concern is always, can that be defined clearly enough so that there really is no potential for dispute later on? Because once the that happens in the if this then that, once the that happens, it's immutable. It's written to the blockchain. As John said earlier, you could write another block to the chain that does the opposite, that pays back money that was paid inappropriately, et cetera. But again, it's a tool. It's not a panacea. So there are certainly going to be possibilities there's the possibility for disputes over the intent of the parties and how that is captured in a smart contract.
All right. I've got time for a couple more questions. Are there any downsides for trying to use blockchain for monitoring HIPAA or compliance of PHI data? Not a panacea, but obviously it's a great tool. I mean, are there any downsides?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's really slow. So
Yeah,
I think that's the big
right,
downside, right? Depending on what you're trying to accomplish,
Yeah.
it can be really slow. The other thing, that's interesting is, and I think it depends on how you've implemented it and what type of blockchain you're using. But there is an element of anonymity that can be included in the blockchain, and how people implement that and how that evolves is going to be interesting, because on the one side, blockchain can confirm who you are, but on the other side, it can also make you anonymous. And so I'm interested to see how those two competing forces evolve as blockchain matures, and see which ones, are there specific use cases where it makes sense to do one or the other. The way in healthcare we look at it and kind of start thinking about this is, okay, well, we want it to be able to identify us when I'm in the office and my provider is treating me on an individual basis. But if they're doing research, then I want all of that data totally anonymized so that I'm not individually discriminated against by my insurance company, or that I'm not whatever, right? So their anonymized data makes sense. So, balancing those two is going to be really interesting. And I don't think HIPAA's thought about that much at all. I think the regulators are going to have some work to do there to understand where it makes sense, this whole anonymity versus actually confirming who you are specifically.
I think the competing interests you just described, John, just sort of highlight for me the potential for the blockchain actually leading to greater atomization of data. And by that I mean you could have an individual provider or payer have a particular patient identification number that's on the blockchain, and that has to be cross-linked to a real patient identifier off of the blockchain in order to link that back to an individual's identity, so that what's on the blockchain is de-identified or at least anonymized, not fully de-identified, and can be used in research or maybe accessed via a public blockchain. But then again, by doing that at the individual payer, say, level, we move away from the ideal of a universal patient identifier and the ideal of having, much more data fluidity.
Well, and it really goes back to, you could do minimum necessary in a much more granular fashion because of the atomized data, as you said. Although it does bring up other questions. If you've created the smart contract, which defines what minimum necessary is, and then that changes, if it's already in the contract, changing the contract, that could be hard because it could happen automatically with the atomized data. So, you get both sides of it, right?
Well,
Yes, you do, and that's why there's always next month to
that's
talk
why there's
about this more.
that's why there's always another HIPAA chat. Thank you for that segue for punting me the football or whatever you want to say, David. Thank you for hosting HIPAA chat. We will be back again. I believe in November for another HIPAA chat. I've got to check our schedule. John, thank you for being our guest today. Fascinating conversation. Great questions from the audience. And we will get a copy of this recording out to you by the end of the week. So, John, again, thank you for your time. And David, of course, we will see you back hosting once again on our next HIPAA chat. So look to your inbox for that invitation. For everybody here on the call today, thanks for joining in.